As you move on to drawing more organic forms like the figure, initially from plaster casts, classical sculptures, and eventually from the model itself, it's important to move past the pure visual abstraction from previous lessons, which, if you remember, is the process of carving away big areas from the envelope, first of all, to reveal the silhouette, much like a sculptor carving away at marble, and move on to the visual construction. This involves using simple geometric shapes to help visualize and understand complex organic forms. This was touched upon in lesson 19, where we drew the initial block-in of a leg from the Charles Bargue Drawing course, using two cylinder-like shapes and a triangular one for the foot to help describe the rudimentary shapes. This concept of the visual construction will be one that you use frequently in drawing, especially in the figure, where it's often easier to find the conceptualized forms rather than a detailed silhouette and then fill in the interior information afterwards. The success of the visual construction is one that is based on all the knowledge you've gained from previous lessons, because it involves making decisions that can't be readily checked against the subject matter, as you'll be conceptualizing forms first of all. It's common to assume that simple geometric shapes means drawing actual boxes, cylinders, circles and triangles, but this can quite often be too much of a simplification of the form and won't help visualize the essential concepts of the subject matter. In reality, we're referring to box-like or cylinder-like forms rather than actual boxes and cylinders. The Charles Bargue course has excellent examples of what is meant by the visual construction and the visual abstraction, and both can be seen together here in this plate. As you can see, the initial block-in has been found using big simple shapes that are made with long straight lines to convey the whole form. Nowhere exemplifies the visual abstraction better than on the stomach area itself, which contain many smaller pieces of information that Bargue has condensed down into 2 lines at the beginning. He could have gone a step further in the simplification and simplified the arm into this block-in. But in only a few lines, the entire side of the torso has been described. The visual construction can be seen in the arm and leg. By using 2 cylinder-like forms, the top and lower arm is visualized. Bargue has shown that the arm can be seen as a cylinder by leaving this faint line for the top of the arm in this drawing, showing the viewer how he is visualizing and seeing the arm as a simple geometric shape at the beginning. And whilst you wouldn't want to draw 2 actual cylinders for the whole arm, thinking in this really simplistic sense allows you to understand the upper and forearm portion, position and tilt in space. The forearm is a cylinder that tapers in towards the wrist, but with the bulk of the forearm muscles added on top of this simplified shape. Much like a sculptor developing forms with clay on top of an armature. Adding the various smaller forms on top of this cylinder is easy once this big proportion is found. A great insight into the visual construction is the leg. See how the forms of the leg continue through the hand. Here he is emphasizing the idea that the leg should be seen as a big, simple geometric shape, and how the whole interior information has been reduced down to basically 1 line, removing the small information where the material overlaps the leg. The material itself is also a great example of reducing a subject down to its core elements, finding only what is necessary to tell the viewer what the forms are. By simplifying like this, you'll be able to rapidly block in a whole drawing, which will allow you to make essential changes without the baggage of having to remove hours of work. It also helps capturing the big movement, like for example the bending at the torso, which Bargue has shown in just a few simple lines within the interior forms. Some of the lines don't play a role in the final tonal drawing, but guide the artist into understanding the form, like the side of the rib cage here. These simple lines help visualize the tilt of the torso, and it is important this initial block-in is an overload with information, as it will lose the power it has to clearly show the big forms. The temptation is always there to add more and more information, a bit like being in a sweet shop or a art materials store for artists. You can keep getting more and more things, but really think about what you need that clearly shows the big design. As well as being able to visualize the forms turning and twisting in space, this simplification will allow you to create salient points that you can easily reference in 2 dimensions. Using the absolute truths of verticals and horizontals first of all to check the placements that have been made. This is virtually impossible when lots of information is found, so keep the block-in clear and concise. After these horizontals and verticals, long diagonals like here from the head to the elbow and the inside of the torso can be found using these horizontals and verticals as guides. As mentioned earlier, the visual construction is a key concept in developing successful figure drawings. Beginner students often have a hard time simplifying forms when drawing the figure, as all too often they become involved in the hands or feet or develop a portrait before finding the big design and overall proportions. This is why working from life was always the last stage of a student's development at the academies. Bargue mimics this in the Bargue Drawing course, as towards the end of the course there is a series of simplified male figures. These are the first 2 plates in that section of the course. And as you can see, they're really simple in design and form. They are great examples of how you can and should simplify the forms at the beginning of a drawing, to focus on the whole rather than individual forms like the hands or feet. See how the information in the hands and feet are abstracted down completely to just a handful of lines, and note how the faces are left void of any detail, as the action of the pose is what should be found. In this first plate, Bargue is getting you to see the action of the torso leaning forward by removing all the information within the forms, apart from the overlaps on the stomach and the indication of the centre of the torso to show the viewer the direction and twist of the torso in space, along with a simple indication of the shoulder girdle. And if the torso is seen as an organic box shape, the shoulder girdle would be the top of that box. Importantly, he has indicated the wedging of the smaller forms like the arm into the torso, the neck into the shoulder girdle, and the leg into the hips with strong, simple overlaps. These again put the emphasis on the big shapes rather than any smaller piece of information that you will see. Think of the Bargue course as a course training you to strip away all the irrelevant information you see in a subject to find its essence. If we remove these overlaps, the forms become less understandable and quite flat. It really then shows the power of these overlaps in line. As line is a very limited expression when conveying 3-dimensional forms, it is important to try and use it to full effect, but not simply add information for the sake of adding it. We can also see how the forms Bargue has found are strong and geometric, but not simply stiff cylinders. They have subtle angle breaks that convey the organic nature of the human form, especially here at the elbow and the legs. And by simplifying them into actual cylinders, it's clear how much information is lost. A quick note should also be made about the treatment of hair. Bargue has found it in a solid mass, which is important as this is what gives hair a sense of weight. You could think of it as Lego hair, where the whole hair mass could easily be removed and thought of independently from the rest of the figure. Even on the right-hand figure, Bargue is keeping the hair mass simple, only indicating a few separate groups of hair, keeping the interior free of information, which would just overwhelm the area and confuse the viewer. This is the constant theme throughout all of the figure drawings in the course, even the more advanced plates, and shows the importance Bargue placed on thinking of the hair as a single large mass, limiting the amount of interior information, as this can be seen in these later plates. There are a few subtle differences between the two figures, as the left figure only contains clean lines, whereas the right contains many more sketchy lines. This is common in the initial stages of a drawing. This is a cropped section of the knees and elbows from both figures, And you can see the right-hand figure contains all the attempts at finding correct lines, whereas the left only shows the final lines. Whilst we'll never know, as not much information on how to use the Bargue drawing course has survived, I like to think this is a view into Bargue's working practice, and the plates could have been included in the course as a way of showing the student that you never find the perfect line straight away, and it's not about first-time perfection, but understanding how to make changes and adapt, as mistakes are always going to be made, especially when drawing from life models, as even the most skilled model will move when posing. By looking closely at the figure, the initial blocking lines can be seen, which is an invaluable source of information in understanding Bargue's procedure. And by drawing over them, we get the big simple lines of the visual construction. See how he's treating these forms as big, simple geometric shapes. The whole torso is essentially one long, boxy cylinder. It's important to note, even though this plate is far more sketchy and loose than the plate on the left, Bargue has still kept the interior information simple, only indicating the hips to help show the tilt, and where the obliques, ribcage and abdominals meet to show the three-dimensional box-like nature of the upper torso and hips. Also the strong overlaps of the arms and subtle forms of the calf, which help give depth to the leg. By removing it, it creates a flat environment. It really shows how every line has carefully been thought about and how it affects the overall drawing. Another artist that epitomizes the classical approach to art is William Bouguereau. And even though his paintings are rich in detail, like this painting, Nymphs and Satire, the preliminary sketches give us an insight into the same simplified approach to drawing that we see in the Bargue drawing course. He manages to create powerful sketches by this process of simplifying and boiling down the information to its essence. In these sketches, he conveys only the interior information that is needed, while keeping the big statement and design clear and easily visible. And that is the purpose of line when the goal is to create a fully developed tonal drawing, or in this case painting. By using the sketch as a guide, you can trace over the final painting, and it becomes clear how Bugaroo achieved all the information needed for the figure in a relatively simple sketch. So it's really a testament to the power of simplification, and if you find yourself beginning to lose the big design of a drawing, remove all the smaller bits of information or simplify and unify them together to create a strong visual statement. This is a sketch by Pierre-Paul Prud'hon, another French classical draftsman and painter who was taught in the academic French style of the time. Even though it's a pretty complex drawing, using the principles of the visual abstraction and the visual construction, we can begin to build up an accurate copy. Firstly, using the visual abstraction to find the initial envelope, which details the height and width, then the simple block-in to find the big proportions and to understand how the whole drawing works together. Then using the visual construction to quickly flesh out the forms in big, simple geometric shapes, treating the head and torso as simple boxes, for example, and the arms as cylinders, allowing me to visualize the subject as a series of connected geometric shapes, slowly developing these forms like the torso, and also finding the overlaps in the arms and shoulder. I removed the initial block-in soon after the big simple shapes of the visual construction have been found, making continuous adjustments to the whole drawing and moving these shapes around if I have to. It's important not to feel attached to any of these shapes early on, as they're always going to be liable to change. Just like in the plates, I leave out any information within the portrait at first, concentrating solely on the big forms. I am constantly using horizontals and verticals to check placement, like here at the back of the knee, to check the position is in the right place. So always going back to the idea of the visual abstraction and gridding points to check their accuracy using the absolute truth of horizontals and verticals instead of diagonals, which can be susceptible to error. I am looking at the leg this time, not as a cylinder, but more of a box. Drawing the leg as a simple box allows me to visualize it in space and understand its tilt and direction. Also, treating the leg this simply allows me to check if the leg is working in terms of proportion and placement. I'm really looking for the overlaps, especially in the arms, as the arms are very much forms that sit in the torso and not at the back or front. And you can also see the overlaps in the arms are one of the few overlaps I find in the interior information at the moment, along with an indication for the placement of head. These simple lines really help show how forms interact with each other. It is far more important that the information of the big forms work, like for example the arm on the left, which by finding horizontal I can see it is sitting too high. So instead of trying to adjust lots of smallish shapes, I strip it back to the big simple cylinder form. This understanding of seeing forms as simple shapes is really what Bargue is trying to get us to see in these early plates. Looking at the back leg, I'm visualizing this one as like two cylinders, and so even on the same model we get entirely different understanding of how forms can be seen as geometric shapes, and how these geometric shapes can be used to think about forms. I was struggling with the raised arm, and so like the left arm, instead of trying to move lots of smaller pieces of information, I removed them all and returned to the simple cylinder shape and tried it again, checking the vertical placement from the wrist to the knee. Towards the end I start developing the interior information, like the information of the rib cage, but never worried about small information, as this linear stage is not about details, but setting the blueprint for the tonal values later on. Even though I'm getting to the end of this drawing, the portrait has still been kept simple. The hair is a solid mass with no particular attempt made to find smaller details. I have found the top of the brow line though that helps show the viewer the direction that the model is looking in and visualizes the head as a three-dimensional box, and a handful of lines to show the ear, which is a great way of showing a tilt in a portrait. Lastly, making a quick note of the shadow shapes below the model. This helps the viewer see the drawing as a form sitting in an actual space. Even a few simple lines help show this. As well as figure drawing, the visual construction is also used in developing geometric shapes, like this plate of Jupiter in the Charles Bargue drawing course. We see lots of subtle changes and small areas of form, like in the beard, and lots of small detail in the crown, which if one was to attempt to draw all of them straight away, you would pretty quickly become lost in all the detail. Bargue, though, uses the visual construction to simplify all this information into simple geometric shapes, and that creates a much clearer and easier visual understanding of the subject, and gives the artist the power to create clear proportional boundaries that allows you then to study the placement and size of a particular element in isolation, confident that it will work with the whole drawing. This will in turn create a clear pathway for successfully completing a drawing. This concept of the visual construction is one that will interweave itself into all elements of learning, not just drawing, but learning to see visually, and will take time to learn. So practice often, but remember this is a shorthand, so there is no right or wrong. And success is really based on the fact that you'll have a clear path to drawing complex shapes from simple linear forms.